They say that if you speak to God, it's a prayer. But if God speaks to you, it's a problem. If so, why do we pray? Why do we spend hours every week in prayer? Why do we speak? Who do we speak to when we pray? And does God need our prayer? These are important questions which help us to understand the main purpose of prayer. It is probably about us, a declaration of our beliefs and values. Prayer is a reminder to focus our thoughts and hearts on what is important in life. We say Shema in the middle of our morning and evening prayers. Some people say that it is not prayer at all, but rather a declaration of our core belief. Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael. The eternal God, one is our God. Adonai Eloheinu, the eternal God is one. Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish from Talmud said, at the end of his life, Jacob called to his children and said, gather yourself together that I may tell you what will happen. But then Jacob became faint. He understood that he will soon die. According to the Babylonian Talmud, at that moment he thought, well, perhaps my children are unfit, not worthy. He wanted his family to live in peace and continue the tradition. But he was afraid that the past conflicts would make them fight with each other, rather than building the future together. All the children came to him and said, hear, O Israel, referring to Jacob by his other name. Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael. The Eternal One is our God. The Eternal God is one. Just as there is only one God in your heart, so there is only one God in our hearts. At that moment, Jacob felt at peace and responded, Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Blessed be the name of God's glorious kingdom forever and ever. This is a midrash, a legend, which serves as an addition to this week's Torah portion. It connects the narrative of the Torah with verses from the book of Genesis, with the verses from the book of Deuteronomy, which we know as Shema, as prayer Shema. Therefore, today, when we say Shema, not only we declare the monotheistic belief, but also we remember this story, the Jacob's family, and we think of people dear to us and declare that regardless of what happens in the world and to all of us, we have something which unites us no matter what. We end Shema with the recital of Lema'an Tizkeru, a paragraph which is traditionally called the third paragraph of Shema. We say, so that you remember Tizkeru and do all my commandments. Rabbeinu Bachya, a 13th century Spanish rabbi and scholar of Judaism, explains that it is obligatory when reciting the Shema or Leman Tizkeru, this paragraph, to emphasize the Z sound in the letter Zayin in the word Tizkeru. And the reason for this is so that we do not confuse ourselves with the word Tizkeru, which comes from the root meaning payment, sachar. For one is not to say prayers or perform commandments in order to expect a reward. Prayer is not a magical spell. We do not expect a miracle to happen only because we say some words in a particular order. God on Trial is a British television play. It takes place in Auschwitz during Holocaust. The Jewish prisoners put God on trial for abandoning the Jewish people. The question they discussed is whether God has broken his covenant with the Jewish people by allowing the Nazis to commit genocide. The group of Auschwitz prisoners concluded that God was indeed guilty of breaking covenant. But my favorite part of this film is the sin which comes at the end. After coming to that conclusion, what do you think they did? They started to pray. Many people live with a paradox and a difficult unanswered question today. On the one hand, we want to reconcile God with all tragedies which sometimes happen to good and innocent people. But on the other hand, we have an existential or personal question of why so many people persist with faith despite their suffering. Why did God create COVID and allow it to spread? Humanity has been asking many similar questions throughout history. This challenge and the paradox of faith despite suffering leads many people to abandon their tradition and forget their past. So did Joseph. We know this from the names of his children. He named his firstborn son Menashe, saying, and I quote from the Torah, "It is because God has made me forget all my troubles and my father's household." He named his second son Ephraim, saying, It is because God has made me fruitful, successful in the land of my affliction. Both names are meaningful names, and Joseph achieved a successful career and became a true Egyptian. Having done so, he tried to forget his past, his tradition, and his belief. Many people respond to suffering in this way. In his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Rabbi Harold Kushner writes about and for people who are going through crisis. When this book was written, it became highly controversial because of Kushner's conclusion about God. In the book, he refuses to accept the most common religious explanations for suffering. Many religious leaders used some challenging theological explanations of suffering. Some say that it is a punishment for sin. Others say that it is part of God's larger plan, that things even out in the long run, that victims are somehow prepared by God, that tragedy can be a lesson from God, and many, many others. So the author of this book reached a radical conclusion for a rabbi, that God cannot be all-loving and all-powerful at the same time. Kushner sided with an all-loving God. When faced with the suffering of innocence, God is simply unable to stop it. In order to make room for creation of the world and humanity, God restricted their power and became simply unable to intervene and stop such painful events. This explanation works well when speaking about suffering caused by people to other people. But what about natural disasters? Well, Rabbi Kushner was quite comfortable using the same line of responding to explain the natural disasters too. In one of the interviews about his book, he said, "I solved the problem in my book by compromising God's power in order to maintain God's goodness. What I do in this case," meaning in the case of natural disasters, "what I do in this case is separate God from nature. God," he says, "is kind, fair, loving, and moral. Nature is not." Perhaps it is our destiny as people to fight again against the injustice, danger, and unfairness of this world. Sometimes nature is cruel, dangerous, very powerful threat to our existence. And this is exactly why we need our faith, our religion, and something which unites us. Instead of fighting with each other, instead of building fences, our responsibility as people is to protect each other, support the most vulnerable, build relationships, form agreements. In the world where so many forces are trying to divide us, our religious and human responsibility to come together and say, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Eternal One is our God. The Eternal God is one. And when we say it, let's hope that we don't hear anything as an answer.